was elected as secretary of the Zionist Federation of South Slavic countries. Going back to talk about student life in general, we have to imagine too that those students who were active for Zionism in the different places all over the monarchy, that their daily life or their student life, how they could meet and how they could propagate Zionist ideology and was different than student life today. So, as Branko mentioned, my book about Egon Zweig, so he was one of those active students, not from Croatia, he came from Olomouc, from Moravia, but in one of his diaries, he described very intensively how student life happened, or what does it mean to be a Jewish national student in Vienna or in the Zionist as well. So you have to remember that in Vienna at least, and I think it was the same in other cities as well, so every Saturday you were obliged, once you are a member of a fraternity, you were obliged to go to the university and to walk up and down with your friends from the same organization in the court of the university. So in Vienna it was the Arkadenhof, and on one side the National German organization, on the other side the Jewish ones, and regularly, so from the 1890s on, and with the increasing anti-Semitism as well at universities, you would have fights at the end of this stroll. In German they called it Bummel. So it was the student Bummel, the fraternities. So the problem was that once you are there, at the end there's a fight. And usually the Jewish students, and I think that it's a good point to come back to what you are allowed or about clothes, what you do and what you couldn't do is, if you, like some of the student organizations did, is not just they did the fencing, but they also wanted to walk with caps. Caps like the German students' fraternities had in different colors, whatever you belonged to. And in 1898, it was for the first time that the Jewish fraternity, the Libanonia, decided they have the same rights like all the other students' fraternities, and they put caps on it. From the start on, most of the other students' fraternities said, this is nonsense, because this is a German habit, we don't need it, we are Jews, we are Zionists, we have different things. But they went for it, and of course what happened? The German fraternities said, that can't be, only we had the right to walk like this. So, and a big fight started at the university, and of course all the other Jewish fraternities they fought with the Lebanese, even they were against the caps, and the police didn't interfere. That was, and even the rector and the university didn't want to interfere. They wanted the Jewish students shouldn't go with the caps, but in the end the Jews went with the caps, and all those fights, you had it regularly on the university campus. So the students, or Jewish students as agents, as I mentioned at the beginning, you see they had two developments. Once within the student life, within the universities, how to fight for their standing, fight for their ideology or what they ever wanted to promote, and at the same time they tried to support the Zionist movement outside the university. So not just in going or standing at the gatherings of Zionists, promoting, handing out leaflets or organizing lecture series, but also they went back home to their cities they tried to bring those modern ideologies from the cities to the small places within their communities. And for some of those small communities or peripheral communities throughout the monarchy, as we know from reports and from letters of leaders of those communities, it was quite a shock as well, because there were small communities, and then those young men came back with swords, and they wanted to parade, they wanted military activities, dueling, and things those communities never heard before. And so there was always a big discussion between the young generation and the elders as well. And as I mentioned, so the conscious adoption of the structure and the activities and the honor codes of those German fraternities embedded the Jewish fraternities members in the mainstream student culture, as I mentioned before. The important thing is that until World War I, the students' organizations succeeded to continue their activities on both sides. So once in the universities and outside of the universities in the small communities. With World War I, and then of course with the dissolution of the Habsburg monarchy, the whole situation changed. But even then, at least for the Moravian context, we know the students tried to reopen when they came back from the war, and most of the students were soldiers in the war. They wanted to reopen those fraternities. Even if the students, or because of the new national borders, students didn't, for example in Moravia, didn't went to Vienna to study, but more of them went to Prague or to Brno because of the new national borders. They still stick to those codes and to those organizational structures, like continuing with those fraternities, even working under different contexts and possibilities, doing the same work. So I think I will stop because time is running out at this point, and leave open everything else for the discussion. So thank you very much.
So please, if anyone has any question after this also very interesting lecture.
First of all, I would thank both of our lecturers for, I think, very interesting lectures. And I will ask colleague about, can you tell us something a bit more about differences between the ordinary student organizations and the Jewish students organizations? Are there what are the similarities and differences in their activities, organizations, and so on?
Going back to Herzl, I think it's a good example. So until the 80s, a lot of Jews were involved in non-Jewish organizations. So like Herzl or other students who were members of so-called German fraternities. But then with the anti-Semitic movement within those organizations, and later on with the Weidhofener resolutions, Jews were expelled from those organizations. But even before, I think, like I mentioned, Kadima, Jewish students said, okay, we have to found our own organizations with, so there are differences. Some of them were Zionists, only Zionists. Some of them were Jewish nationalists. It means they were supporting the notion that there's a Jewish nation and the government should recognize a Jewish nation in the Habsburg monarchy as well. And some of them were both. So it differs always if you look into the detail about their own organization. But the main difference was, of course, the Jewish organizations were for Jews only at the beginning and later on too, and the general organization, which became more and more German national fraternities, were anti-Semitic in the end. There are still exceptions where you have some of organizations where Jews could participate, but the main difference is, of course, that you have Jewish and non-Jewish organizations and the dueling. So I think even within the German or the non-Jewish fraternities and the Jewish fraternities, the main difference is if you belong to a dueling fraternity or a non-dueling. And on these lines, you have to look what was going on within those organizations. And of course, then you have the cap, the bandage, it depended, and the colors of the bandage, and that says always what you're up and what you're doing, and even from the names. So if you take the Bagiora, then you see already, so who is the hero from whom they took the name or what they wanted. So you see from the names sometimes already part of the ideology program, what they intended and what they wanted to do.
First, I would like to thank you on your interesting lecture, and a question to think about the different dynamics between Austrian part and Hungarian part. Was it only because of the anti-Semitism of German fraternities, and in general, was it, what were the reasons in Hungarian part being late in organizing different Zionist organizations?
I think in this case, the Zionists, the student organizations, went along with general organizations. So the Zionist movement within the Hungarian part of the monarchy was a so-called latecomer. So it was always weak. It was always very small in the members and what they could reach. So if you talk latecomer, okay, 10 years is already a lot. So if you think, okay, you started when you start, the Zionist movement became a big movement and a political movement with Herzl, and then it took another 10 years until in Hungary you had a lot more organizations. So it says more about the structure and the communities in Hungary. So once you talk about Jewish communities and how they built their own life, then you see that there are a lot of differences between the Austrian and the Hungarian part. Like you had, in the Austrian part you had the Einheitsgemeinde, so within the Jewish communities. So you had only one community, and the Reform or the Orthodox must be within this community. In the Hungarian part you had the division in Neolog, as you know, and in the Orthodox and status quo. So that makes already a different kind of Jewish life, or the structure of Jewish life within big or smaller towns or even villages. And if you consider these differences, then of course every new movement, political or religious movement, could increase or went forward in different steps and took different times. And I think this is one of the reasons why in Hungary you had the Zionist movement much later growing and being active than in the Austrian-Hungarian part.
I'm sorry. I would be really interested in these vacation fraternities if they had local conflicts or conflicts were rather typical in between student communities in Vienna and big cities. You also mentioned here a generational difference between older and younger people in these local communities. And I think it's rather super interesting because it seems that in cities the generational conflict is right the opposite of. So the point is the older liberal generation accepts way more the presence of Jewish students and even professors at universities, while the younger generations express way more resistance. So it is very typical, for example, that in the Budapest University, the first Jewish professor, Henrik Marceli, who was, by the way, a historian who was interested in South Slavic issues. So he was normally appointed by a liberal cultural minister, like, okay, that's okay, why not? He is a great professional, but he was not accepted by young students who organized real physical fights in the halls of the university and so on. So it seems that older generation was, in this case, more open to these changes than the younger generation. And it seems like that it's the opposite, that what you've mentioned in vocational fraternities and local conflicts.
I think it went in both directions. So you had, on one hand, so you have a multiple movement. So at the one hand, you had those liberals, so in the 1860s, 70s, and later on, so like Herzl went to general fraternity in a German one. And then the new generation, so the youngsters in the 1880s and 1890s, they became in a way, on one hand, much more nationalistic. They said, okay, we won't sit together with those German nationalists. We are Jews. We had to fight for our own honor and for our own pride. So we found new organizations. We became a kind of part of a national movement. So we are not agreeing with the liberal attitudes. And at the same time, when it became more nationalistic, in other parts or in other life circumstances, like in those small communities, they brought into those small communities a complete different attitude, how you could live your Jewish identity, how you could, what are the perspectives of your life. So I think it's sometimes it's the same. On one hand, they are much more nationalistic. On the other hand, they bring a new, even if they were nationalistic, but they demanded that there should be a more liberal attitude against them too, so that they could be part of they could enter the communal life, they could be part of the social life there and participate. So I think it's going in the same direction.
Thank you very much for the lecture. And I have interest for one question. What was the reaction of the Austrian Christian socialists and Weber's followers to the appearance of Zionistic movement? And second, was there any link between Zionistic movement in Austria at that time with some other abroad similar organizations?
Yes, of course, there were a lot of cooperations because once the Zionist conferences, the World Organization started in 1897, you had it every year at the beginning, then every second year. So you had the gatherings. You had the gatherings between Zionists from not only from the different parts of the Habsburg monarchy, but also with Zionists from Russia, from Great Britain, from all over the world. But at the same time, there were always ideologically differences, even within, let's say, within the Habsburg monarchy. So if you look at all the conflicts between the Galician Zionist organization and let's say they called it Inner Austria organization, which meant what nowadays is Austria and Bohemia and Moravia, more or less. So there were deep ideological conflicts always. So sometimes they couldn't even decide to vote for a president, or they couldn't unite within their monarchy. So there were always difficulties and discussions and different approaches. And what you meant in relation to the general Austrian socialist movement, if I understood you correctly, of course, for them, Zionists, it was a nationalistic movement which has no place within the social democratic movement, because once you will find that of course within the Zionist movement you had bourgeois parties, you had socialist, you have communist parties, so you will find within the Zionist movement the same party lines like in the general as well. But for the party, so you could be, of course, if you're a Zionist, you could be a member of the Social Democratic Party as well. So, because if you're a Social Democratic, then you could be within, because Zionism was, at least then later on in Austria, it was part of an extraterritorial movement which is not related to Austrian politics.
It's not a question, it's more like a comment. In wider context, Zionism actually is reaction on failure of how to say it, it's a Jewish emancipation. So it's like in a way reactionary movement, and so from within we usually don't talk about Zionism, sometimes we even talk about Zionisms, because ideologically it's not one, yes, it's very diverse, just because it actually started as a reaction to something. So
I would also like to add one small comment to what you said. The success of Zionism in all countries in Austro-Hungarian monarchy and also in Croatia really depended on this leadership of the Jewish communities in the towns. For you mentioned Osijek, it wasn't just, there is a reason why Osijek was first town which embraced Zionism, because the head of the Jewish community in Osijek was Hugo Spitzer, who was a lawyer. He wasn't very young at the moment, but he embraced those young students who were from Osijek and Zagreb, and that's the reason why the first Zionist congresses will be summoned in Slavonia, Croatian Zionist congresses, and that's why Slavonia and Osijek were the center of the Zionism at the beginning. Zagreb Jewish community was led by the people who were much more assimilated, and they resisted Zionism, if I'm not wrong, till the end of the First World War. The Zagreb Jewish community fell after First World War. And regarding this cooperation, let it be mentioned that at the first Zionist Congress in Basel, there were two members from Croatia, and one of them was this Rabbi Markus Ehrenpreis, who was cooperative of Theodor Herzl, and later he claimed that he started promoting Zionism in Slavonia, especially in Đakovo, in Dinosjek, as soon as he became a rabbi, and as soon after Herzl published his Judenstadt. But he said that it was talking in vain. Nobody listened to him, and he was very disappointed and left to Bulgaria. But a few years ago, he received invitations to come to Osijek to give lectures and to help these young students who were supported by Hugo Spitzer. Is there any other questions? Or we are coming to the end of this first colloquia in this series. If we are, I would also like to thank once again to Veronika and Dieter, and I would like to thank you all. I hope that it was interesting and fruitful, and it was worth to spare these two hours of this beginning of the week. Thank you very much all.